Now, friends, thank you very much. I have a problem. My problem is this. For the last 20, nearly 30 years, I have spent my time trying to teach Christian and other people how to understand Islam. I want to do it with sensitivity, with understanding. I want to do it in a way that they can grow in respect, and I want to do it in a way that they can come to love the Islam that they're learning about. Because what is crucial here is that whether you're a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian, if one takes seriously that we are worshipping the one and only God, then we have no arrogance to say, God cannot speak to me through the faith tradition of another one of God's heavenly revealed religions. Okay, that's my starting point. Now what's my problem? My problem, well, you've gathered it, it's Muslims. In particular, it's the kind of Muslims who turn up as mosque leaders and who very often call themselves members of the ulama. Why is that a problem? Because they can undo in a 20-minute visit what has taken me 20 hours to build up in the course of a talk or a series of talks. Now, what I want to do is, if that's your problem too, listen in, because I've got some experience of trying to deal with that. And if that's not a problem, well, Facebook awaits.
It's Twitter.
Oh, I'm sorry. If it works on electricity, it's beyond me. I want then to help people understand Islam in a way that is intellectually satisfying, in a way that answers their questions and doesn't avoid them, in a way that takes on the challenge as well as the opportunity of modernity. And that phrase, the challenge as well as the opportunity, comes from the man that I want to talk about, who was Fazlur Rahman. So first I want to say something about him, and then I want to touch very briefly on three of the critical questions that I think he contributes to, and you'll see how it develops. For those of you who don't know Fazlur Rahman, born 1919 in undivided India, in what we would today call the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. His father was a Deobandi alim, and he was responsible for his initial training. So he had memorized the Quran by the age of 10. By the age of 18, when he was ready to go up to university, his father had put him through the entire Darsi Nizami. We're talking about a man here not only of prodigious memory, but also of a fantastic linguistic ability. So by the time that he was an undergraduate, not only did he command Hazara, Urdu, Persian, and Arabic, but also English, French, and German. And not German like me, but German good enough to translate Goldziher in his spare time when he is an undergraduate. Now, if you've ever tried reading Goldziher in English or in German, you will know this is not a job for an infant. After his time in the University of the Punjab, he gets a scholarship to come to Oxford. 46 to 49, he was in Oxford, and he was writing an Oxford doctorate under two of the great Western scholars of Islam of that period, H.A.R. Gibb and Stefan van den Berg. Now, they, of course, say to him, well, if you want to work in Neoplatonic philosophy, you really must understand that you can't do that without knowing Greek and Latin. So he says, well, come back next week and we'll see what we can do. So he learns Greek and Latin, and he begins then to really get deeper and deeper into this whole philosophical system. So by the time that he graduates at the age of 49, he's come to a huge crisis of faith. He says, all this philosophy that I've been learning leads me only to a kind of stone-cold philosophical God. a God that you can't worship, a God that you can't love, just a concept. So then he takes himself off to Durham, and from 50 to 58 he's working in Durham, teaching Persian literature and philosophy, and at home at night he's working through his crisis of faith. And during these years in Durham, he writes 3 absolutely critical books. He writes a book on the psychology of prophecy. How do you explain to an intelligent Western audience what happens in the sending down of the Quran upon the heart of the prophet? Don't tell me about Jibreel, the angelic postman. Try to take me into something that I can understand intellectually about what is happening here. And Fazlur Rahman works through that whole issue, and he produces the book on prophecy and Islam. A second book that he produces during this time is the book Islam. Now this is the biggest misnomer that you could imagine, because he calls this an introductory book for undergraduates. Well, he may have been able to understand it as an undergraduate, but I struggle still. And in this, he's working through the whole theological problem, because he says, if I reject the cold God of the philosophers, then I must turn back to my theological tradition. Well, I know all about that, because I've done Darcy Nizami under my father, and I found that to be wanting. I found that to be inadequate. And therefore I must work through this whole theological schema once again with the person that I now am, the person shaped by 10 or a dozen years of deep immersion in the philosophical systems. And he comes up with the book Islam. Come back to that later. Now, from 58 to 61, he's in McGill in Canada. Why is that important? Because McGill is set up by Wilfred Cantwell Smith as a place where leading Muslim and leading Christian scholars of Islam can sit and work together, where they can feed and challenge and struggle with each other. So here is Fazlur Rahman sitting with Syed Naguib al-Attas from Malaysia, sitting with Ismail al-Faruqi from Palestine, with Charles Adams, and they are struggling and working together. So he's sharpening his understanding, also by defending it and working with others. 62 to 68, he goes off to Pakistan at the invitation of President Ayub Khan to become the head, the leading thinker of the Central Institute of Islamic Research, so that he can apply his learning to the question of the future of Pakistan. As we all know, Pakistan has been in a crisis since its conception. What is this? As a homeland for Muslims of India, or as an Islamic state? How do we apply Islam to a modern state in order to bring about a situation in which a true Islamic reality can come about? Well, that was the charge that was laid at the door of Fazlur Rahman during these years. He left rather a hurry, along with his wife, before they could get him in the last quarter of 1968. He then spent the last 20 years of his life at Chicago. And in Chicago, which those of you who know the American university scene is top division, in Chicago he is working again with mainly non-Muslim postgraduate students who are trying to understand Islam. He is trying to shape their way of understanding to make it intellectually satisfying for them. So this is Fazlur Rahman. I want now just to touch on three of the themes on which he's worked. I don't intend to try and explain them, because the history of studies of Fazlur Rahman is that every time you try and condense it into a few minutes, you distort entirely what the man had to say. But I do want to touch on these three issues, because these are three of the questions that I constantly face in my teaching. The first is the question, how can you call the Quran the Word of God when it appears in Arabic on the lips of a man called Muhammad? How does it get down to him? How can you say that it is the Word of God when it flows from the mouth of Muhammad without turning him into a loudspeaker? Because the Quran says of itself that it is sent down upon the heart of Muhammad. So how does it get from the heart of Muhammad to his lips? And God doesn't trot around speaking Arabic, so how did he get robed in the Arabic language in the first place? Now, Fazlur Rahman struggles with these questions and tries to find a way in that famous phrase, which is the one that, under certain manipulative forces, got him thrown out of Pakistan just about with his life. He says, the Quran is wholly and absolutely the Word of God, but also, in the ordinary sense of the term, it's also the Word of Muhammad. Now, if you want to know how he squared that circle, invitation for next year. Our second problem is this. Fazlur Rahman is not an intellectual lightweight, and he knew it. And so he didn't suffer fools gladly. And therefore, his criteria for who could interpret the Quran are basically two. One, a profound understanding of Arabic language and literature, and two, a highly developed intellect. Now, what he then goes on to say is that we've got lots of problems, because we've got people of very modest intellect who are trying to interpret the Quran, and a lot of them don't have a very developed knowledge of Arabic either. What he wants to say to us is that very often people try to interpret the Quran verse by verse by verse. Most of the tafsir that you read are dealing what we call seriatim, one verse after the other. And in this, he says, you are distorting the message of the Quran. Rather, that we should try to understand the Quran, first of all, holistically. From the whole, we should take what he calls the elan, the spirit, the thrust, what's it trying to do? And then we should work out our tafsir thematically and not seriatim. And then he develops a whole system of hermeneutical keys to actually work with the Quranic text. And that's the invitation for 2019. And now, finally, another problem. Yesterday, we had a discussion about, did exactly Islam liberate women or not? Some of you might have been here. And one of the things that came up was, well, just how reliable anyway are some of the hadith, in particular some of the anti-hadith. They're always anti-something, And some of them, of course, are anti-women. The one that we had yesterday was the one about the proportion of men to women that there are in the fires of hell. Now, Fazlur Rahman also examined this question, and he draws up a very clear understanding. He says, first of all, these Arab people who were around Muhammad, they memorized their folklore, for goodness sake. They memorized their genealogy for generations. who could possibly think that they're not going to memorize and to understand and pass on the sunnah of the Prophet? How he interprets the Quran, how he puts it into practice. Therefore, he says, the concept of sunnah must be wholly defensible. However, our problem is how that concept gets transformed. And two things to say here in my last minute and a half. One is, Fazlur Rahman gives us a hugely important lesson. Do not assume that Western non-Muslim scholars of Islam are fools. Most of them don't get the job if they're a fool. Now, there are some of them, of course, who hate Islam. Okay, leave those out of the question. But there are a whole lot of other people who have spent decades of their lives working on these issues, and maybe they have something useful to say. And so Fazlur Rahman, having worked with all these great stars in the constellation, says we have to learn from their methodology, we have to learn from their working. We don't necessarily have to agree with their conclusions, but we can piggyback on their intellectual effort. Secondly, I just leave you with this image, which I think is a little tantalizing for 2020. Whenever you put sugar into your tea, you have a solid sugar. You put it into the tea, you stir it in, the solid has completely disappeared. No solid left, but all the sugar's in the tea. Now see the reverse of that process. When you have a salt which is in that solution, you go to the seaside and you see the salt that comes up on the stones because it's dried there. Well, that salt used to be in the water, but you didn't know it was there, and now it crystallizes out onto the stone. Same salt, different form, crystal as opposed to solution. You get the picture. Now, what Fazlur Rahman says is that the sunnah of the Prophet, that is the way that he lived out the message, his living Quran does, his perfect humanity, shaped by the Quran, etc., is contained in the living sunnah of the community for the first few generations, until we come to that period of hadith collection, at which time it crystallizes out. Exactly the same substance is there, but goes from being liquid in the lived sunnah into crystals in the hadith. So he speaks not here of hadith fabrication, but of crystallization. And in that way, he begins to give us a way of understanding how the hadith crystallize out from the lived experience of the community. Thank you.